Hello, welcome to CABE 2020, and I'm going to talk, believe it or not, about bilingual education. And I think bilingual education is doing very, very well in some ways, but I think we can do even better. We have two goals in bilingual education. One goal, of course, is English, and I think we've done quite well there. If we look at the analyses that have been done of bilingual programs, going back to the very first one, groundbreaking Ann Willig's meta-analysis, all the way up to what I think is the most recent, Grace McField's, which I think is the most thorough so far. Bilingual education does well. Children in bilingual programs do better in English reading than children in all English immersion programs, and we'll see why as we go. So goal number one of bilingual ed is English, and we've done quite well. And I think we can do better, but we've done well. The second is the continuing development of the child's home language, the heritage language. And here I think there's lots and lots of room for improvement. Before we get into this, of course, I have to do the traditional bit and talk about theory, language acquisition. Let me try to summarize my work for the last 45 years or so, and the work of many other people who went before me and while I was working. The answer to the question, how is language acquired? Not what we thought. We don't acquire language by hard study. We don't acquire language by memorizing lists of vocabulary words, or by studying complicated grammar rules, or by speaking. You don't learn to speak a language by speaking more, counterintuitive. And you don't acquire language by writing it more. There's only one way, and this is our conclusion based on the research. We acquire language when we understand it. When we understand what people are telling us, and we understand what we read. We call this comprehensible input. It's a subconscious process. While it's happening, you don't know it's happening. Once it has happened, you're not always aware that anything has taken place. So we have confused cause and effect in language studies. The cause is comprehensible input. The result is vocabulary grammar. You don't study vocabulary and grammar, you get comprehensible input. This idea is certainly not new with me. Several people knew about it before I did, and in several related fields. In the field of literacy, best example, Kenneth Goodman said a long time before I started working, he said, we learn to read by reading. We learn to read by understanding what's on the page. Frank Smith came up with very similar conclusions all around the same time. And their work has influenced me a great deal, and I was delighted to read it after I'd been working, and I thought it was all my idea. And here it was somewhere else, phrased very beautifully and based on different data than mine. So it's very satisfying. Also, people in second language have come up with similar ideas. Leonard Newmark is one whose work I read quite a bit before I started mine, professor at San Diego, and he said pretty much the same thing, that we acquire language when we understand it. James Asher, the inventor of total physical response, said pretty much the same thing. Harris Winnitz, working in the Midwest, said the same thing. Newmark's case is very interesting for several reasons. We had the same idea. I was dependent on his work. And a long time ago, about 20, 25 years ago, I went to my aunt and uncle's 50th wedding anniversary. My uncle and aunt, Boris and Ann Newmark, see the connection? Anyway, I went to the party, and there was Leonard. I said, Leonard, what are you doing here? He said, Steve, what are you doing here? My aunt and uncle. No, it's my aunt and uncle. Turns out we're related through my aunt and uncle, and here we had the same ideas. Anyway, what Newmark said, in addition to his data, is that if we want comprehensible input to work, you have to pay attention to the input, obviously. And the conclusion I came to, or my conjecture, was that that's much easier to do when the input is very, very interesting. In fact, I think interest is not enough to make sure. If you really want to make sure you have language acquisition, the input has to be very interesting. The word I like is compelling. So interesting, you temporarily forget that you're listening to or reading another language. The A case history that really helped me understand how this all works and how motivation works was told to me by my former student, Christy Lau, now a professor in the San Francisco area, San Francisco State. She told me the story of her son, Vincent. We called him, gave him a different name in the article, but his real name is Vincent. He's now just graduated college, going on to grad school. And when Vincent was a little boy, Mom and Dad were very busy. Dad worked in the Silicon Valley, worked hard in the computer industry, and Christy was a new professor and heavy responsibilities. So they occasionally hired a babysitter to watch over the children. The language of the home was Cantonese. As you know, very few other people do, but you know, Cantonese and Mandarin are not the same language. They're different. They're related. If you know one, it'll help you a little in getting the other. But if you speak Cantonese, it doesn't guarantee that it doesn't mean you can automatically speak Mandarin. They're both Chinese languages, but there's some difference. A little shared vocabulary. The home language was Cantonese. And when Vincent was a little boy, the babysitter would come over, turn on the television to Mandarin cartoons. Now, I'm a big fan of children's television. I think they're wonderful. I think the people who write these things are genius. And because the shows were so interesting, so compelling, Vincent was attracted to them. It helped, the pictures, the visuals helped, the wonderful storylines, the vivid characterization, and the fact that some of the vocabulary was familiar because it was Cantonese and that's related to Mandarin. And the caretaker would help out occasionally, making it comprehensible. So Vincent got hooked on these cartoons, started watching the same shows again and again because they were so good, gradually moved on to children's television as he got older in Mandarin. He watched TV in Mandarin for years. In high school, Dad would come home, Vincent was in high school, and brought 2 movies every weekend for the kids to watch. His family would get together in the evenings, especially during the time when Vincent's grandparents lived with them, and they would watch the news every night in Mandarin. Today, Vincent speaks Mandarin. Christie's told me when company would come over and the family would speak Mandarin, Vincent was absolutely fine. He got along very well, very comfortable. When the family would go on trips to, say, Beijing, a Mandarin-speaking area, or Taiwan, where we speak Mandarin, Vincent had no problems. Here's the big point. Vincent was not particularly motivated to acquire Mandarin. The Chinese government, Hanban, the cultural agency, has been pushing Mandarin for years. The idea is that we are all Chinese, Mandarin is our language, we should have this common language. Vincent ignored all that. He was interested in the stories. He was interested in the cartoons. He had no motivation to learn the language. He was very motivated to understand the storyline. If someone isn't motivated to acquire language and you're teaching the class, tell them a good story. They'll acquire the language whether they're motivated to learn it or not. So compelling input basically solves the problem of motivation. Compelling input is the basis now of our language classes. Stories especially. Stories are wonderful. Children love stories. It's the engine that moves first language. It's the engine that moves second language, first language, second language, young people, older people, etc. Everybody likes stories. In fact, I think it's fair to say that we interpret our entire life in terms of a narrative, in terms of a story in which we are the main character. Data, interesting data. Nearly all children like to hear stories. If you ask, would you like to hear a story? Do you like to hear stories? 95% of children say they do. The 5% who say they don't, their parents don't enjoy telling them stories or reading to them. Adults like stories. Adults like TV shows, not because of the great acting, not because of the great special effects, largely because of the interesting stories. TV, movies, they're popular because of stories. Let me make a suggestion for improving your social life. I know you don't need the help, but maybe this will help occasionally. Let's say you're invited to a party and you don't know anybody. You know you're not going to know anybody. How do you make conversation? How do you get to know people without doing interrogation and fishing around for a common topic? What I do, I go out and watch the latest 3 hit movies. You go up to anyone there and you can start a conversation. Did you see Terminator 28 or whatever? You'll find someone who's seen that movie and you will have an interesting conversation and go on from there. What the data says, the research, children who hear more stories at home do better in school. And of great interest to us, stories act as a conduit to book reading. A former student of mine, Danny Brassel, professor now at Cal State Dominguez Hills, wrote an article that I thought had the best title of any article I've ever seen. This is the title. I think it was published in a journal called Reading Teacher. 16 books went home tonight. 15 were introduced by the teacher. The teacher reads a good story. The kids want to read the end of it or more stories by the same author, etc. Reading stories, hearing stories, telling stories pushes us on to the next thing. And it is, of course, as I mentioned, the foundation of beginning language teaching programs. The program I have been the most connected with, that I've studied the closest, was developed by Beniko Mason for English as a foreign language in Japan. The first phase, story listening. The teacher tells a story, has a list of which words the teacher thinks might be a little bit problematic, and helps make the stories comprehensible by explaining those words, giving a definition, telling more about the story, or in her case, drawing pictures that illustrate it, etc. The goal is not to convince students they have to remember those words. The goal is to make the story more comprehensible. And what Beniko studies have found from this, and Stephen Clark's research, etc., when you do this, the students acquire the vocabulary quite well. In fact, vocabulary acquisition is much more efficient in terms of words acquired per minute than if you do direct instruction on vocabulary. So the second stage, we're being prepared for it by stories. The second stage is reading that students really want to read, compelling reading. And the best way to make the reading compelling is to allow the children to select it themselves. Self-selected reading. The research says self-selected reading, the reading you decided you wanted to read, leads to better vocabulary, better grammar, better writing style, better spelling. Are you listening, Mr. Trump? And is far more effective than direct instruction. The problem with self-selected reading, well, it's no problem, but the problem, we give people, let me start all over again, we give people reading assignments when we give them books. It's not self-selected. I hate getting gift books. When someone gives me a book, they say, well, gee, you're in this field, you should like this, etc. What it is assigned reading. And I dread the moment when the gift giver will ask me later on, how did you like the book I gave you? Garrison Keillor made a really wonderful statement about this in one of his articles. He says, as a former English major, I'm a sitting duck for gift books. In the past few years, I've gotten Dickens, Thackeray, Smollett, Richardson, Emerson, Keats, Boswell, and the Brontes. All of them great, capital G. None of them ever read by me. All of them now on my shelf, looking at me and making me feel guilty. I like getting gift books only from one person. This person knows me better than I know myself. He knows not only what I'm going to like to read, but is exactly what I should be reading, and he's never been wrong. And that's my son. When he says, Dad, check this one out, I always do it, and he's always made the right decision. But that's very rare. Usually we have to select them ourselves. Now, in the history of pedagogy, in language arts teaching, we have been told in recent years not to use fiction in school, or much less fiction, but to use informational books. We got this from the Common Core, which I thought was a major disaster for language arts. The idea was just stories are just to entertain children, and they're of no real value. If you want to be serious and train children for their professions and help them be successful in life and in school, they should be reading nonfiction. Well, the research doesn't support that. In fact, the research has been pretty exciting in the last few years. The research strongly supports fiction. I'll start with one study. This was done in the UK in London, University of London. Researchers gave grown-ups in their 40s a vocabulary test. Native speakers of English. It was an English vocabulary test. The best predictor was reading, how much reading you did. And among the books read, the best predictor was fiction. Highbrow fiction and middlebrow fiction being better predictors than nonfiction. It didn't matter how much they had read in the past, how much vocabulary they had in the past. It's the reading they did when they were in their 40s that was the best prediction. Okay, fiction is going to be the winner here. Let me tell you in case you didn't figure that out. First of all, a number of studies show not only is fiction better for vocabulary, but it's better for the acquisition of academic vocabulary. The critics of fiction, of storybooks, kept saying storybooks don't have the right vocabulary that's going to help you in science, social studies, history, etc. Yes, it does. I'll give you 3 recent studies. One by my former student. What was it from Star Wars? I was the master, you were the student, now you are the master. That's what happened with Jeff McQuillan, who's doing really first-class research. I've learned a great deal from him. He looked at 22 novels aimed at young readers, Nancy Drew, Twilight, etc. He looked at the vocabulary. 85% of the words on known lists of academic words that children need in school, that students need, were there in the stories. 40% of them were frequent enough so that in reading these books, only 22, you probably acquired these vocabulary words. So fiction gives you a lot of what you need in school. It gets even better. Rolls and Rogers study. If you read 1 million words, that's like a year's reading for a middle school child. 1 million words will give you 92% of the science words that experts say you need to do academic studies in science. The last one I just got a few days ago, I got an email from a guy named Clarence Green. Clarence told me, we're now buddies, Clarence, it turns out we had met in Singapore, and he said I owe him a cup of coffee, which I'll be happy to pay off after this exchange. He wanted to tell me about his research. He said, we had coffee, and I told you I wanted to study vocabulary development, and he said that I told him study reading. That's the key. And he said, you were right. He sent me his paper. He analyzed, believe it or not, with the use of the computer, 5,000 novels that kids in high school might be interested in reading. 90% of the words in these novels were present in high school textbooks in a wide variety of topics in pretty good quantity. So you get the vocabulary if you do fiction. Not only that, you get the knowledge. Keith Stanovich, people who read for pleasure, who do more reading for pleasure, know more about a lot of stuff, including academics. They know more about history, literature, science, and practical matters. I had a good example of this, a good application I'm very proud of. I've been talking to my cousin Evelyn lately. She lives in the Chicago area. She just turned 93, so wonderful. Evelyn told me that she's always been interested in the law, finding out about the law. Her late husband, Marty, very nice guy, was a lawyer. He had a degree in law, and Evelyn was always very impressed at how much he knew about just about everything. She felt that knowing about the law school really helped. So she told me that she was interested in maybe taking some classes in law, finding out about it. And I made this suggestion. I said, Evelyn, check this out. Try reading some law novels, especially the work of John Grisham. Okay. And I gave her a gift of law novels. I started sending them to her, etc. And she started reading them. I talked to her the other day. I said, this is preparation for this talk I'm giving now. Evelyn, I've got to know how it's doing with the law novels. Are you learning about legal matters? Are you beginning to understand it? She enthusiastically said yes. And it was not only painless, it was pleasant. She is now addicted to John Grisham novels, and she has learned so much about the law just by reading these novels. It works. Well, there's more than that. I've told you, given you good news, I'll give you a little more. The good news that I've told you already is that fiction contains academic language, and a lot of it. Not only that, it gives you academic knowledge. It also gives what scholars call habits of mind that are very conducive to academic success and life success. People who read a lot learn that the world is a complicated place, and they avoid overly simple solutions because they have been through so much. They have gone with the protagonist in so many novels, in so many situations. They have a better view of how human beings think and how to solve problems. They're also more empathic with other people who read lots of fiction, because again, they've had all this vicarious experience, but it's quite real. A practical point, a real contribution, I think, that's going to reduce suffering and help us out, comes from Beniko Mason in Japan. Again, I mentioned her before. For the beginning stage of her EFL programs is stories, and it leads on to reading. And the reading stage becomes self-selected. It begins with what she calls guided self-selected reading. Her idea is what you need before you start reading the heavy stuff, real stuff, written by native speakers, for native speakers, what we call authentic, is to do lots of easy reading, far more than we ever dreamed. She recommends 2 to 3 years of easy reading in foreign language, largely graded readers, easy stuff. In normal foreign language classes in school, you begin with hard passages, which review the grammar and vocabulary that you're supposed to learn, and then no time at all, you're reading authentic, real literature, real nonfiction. It's very difficult. This makes it much, much better. 2 to 3 years of graded readers. At her university where she worked, she assembled a library of graded readers in English, 5,000 of them, for only 500 students. The students could select, because there was so much there, find things they were interested in. The teacher helped out, because the teacher knew what books were there and knew the students knew it was appropriate. Well, that I think is the missing link. Let's now go on to bilingual education and ways of improving it. I think what we can do, which is quite obvious, I think an easy thing to do, is make sure that students do a lot of reading in their first language as part of bilingual education. We want students in, say, their language arts class in Spanish to do a great deal of reading in Spanish, beginning with easy reading and moving on to harder stuff. That gives you knowledge. Again, knowledge of the world, subject matter knowledge, vocabulary, grammar, all those things. This should be a big part of it. The goal of language arts in bilingual programs, say teaching it in the primary language, which is the right thing to do, is to help children develop a reading habit and make sure they become readers. Well, there's more to it than that, though. We should do it in the beginning, of course. It's one of the great pillars of bilingual education. Teach language arts in the primary language, and teach subject matter in the primary language. Teach math, teach social studies, etc. Not only a reading habit, but teach subject matter, which makes instruction in English much more comprehensible. A standard argument I've been using for years, if a child takes math in the primary language and learns about math, when they start math in English, it'll be much, much more comprehensible than for a child without the math in the primary language. It makes input more comprehensible. So it's a tremendous help to bilingual education and English language development, and it will help build an interest in reading. I want to now go to the second part of bilingual education, heritage language development. Jim Crawford summarizes it like this: there is no disadvantage to developing the heritage language, and wonderful advantages. This area we can do a lot better. Why should we be worried? Well, if we develop the child's heritage language, we develop a lot of things that help the child, not only in school but in life. First of all, I'm sure you'll agree with this, bilinguals are smarter than monolinguals. It's actually true. There are studies that show this. If you take students that are matched on all characteristics except whether they've mastered their home language or not, the ones who are bilingual do better in school. Not a lot better, a little better. It's not true of everyone, but there is a tendency for bilinguals to be smarter. Bilingualism, both languages, has practical advantages. To give you an obvious one, economic. Easier to get work where your bilingualism is valued. And the common example, I think it came from Joshua Fishman, if you want to buy, you can do it in any language. You can do it in English, etc. But if you want to sell, it's good to know your customer's language. Also, if you're bilingual, if you know your family's language well, you profit from the wisdom of the family. You profit from the elders, from grandma and grandpa, the aunts and uncles, etc., and all the wisdom from the country of origin, etc. Now, how do we develop heritage language? The ways we've been doing it, two ways basically, have limits. One, of course, is the parents' use of the language at home. Yes, certainly it's going to start. No, it's going to help. The more you get from your parents, the more you use the language at home, the better off you're going to be. But there are limits to it. You will get conversational language, you'll get everyday language, but unless you engage your parents in deep conversations on sophisticated topics, and complicated topics, there is going to be a limit. The other way we do it is through heritage language classes. They can be so much better. My goodness, they're usually taught traditionally, as everyone here knows, but it can be helped. It can be done much, much better, and we'll see how. The big breakthrough in heritage language development came, I think, with a paper written by a former student of mine, Lucy Say. Lucy, a paper published in one of the best-known prestigious educational journals, she looked at children who were in families that came to the United States when the children were very young or they were born here. The children she looked at all reached very high levels of competence in the heritage language. How did they do it? Quote, nearly all the participants developed an interest in reading for pleasure, which they credited for their advanced reading ability as adults. Reading choices, mostly fiction, leading on to heavier stuff, but still mostly fiction. Grace Cho, my former student here, now professor at Cal State Fullerton, has found similar things with people who've come to the United States quite a bit later. The ones, she found quite a few who were very good in the heritage language. All of them were dedicated pleasure readers. Well, this is all well and good, but if we're going to make this happen, what's necessary is that heritage language speakers have to have access to books in the heritage language. Even in Spanish, the situation is depressing. Sandra Pucci and Sharon Ulanoff at USC did a number of studies in the 90s looking at the access to Spanish books, Spanish novels, magazines, etc., in libraries in California in areas where the 90% of the families were Spanish speaking. The libraries had very little. They could order very little. They were very limited. Some libraries, it was less than one book per child. The public libraries weren't much better. So even in Spanish, where it should be fairly easy to do this, access to books in Spanish is not all that easy to find. My new colleague, Nishad Ashtari, came to California a few months ago, and she got interested in working in this area. She's looked at the access to books in Farsi, the language of Iran, and also to some extent in Afghanistan. The families here in Southern California, there are quite a few of them, and there are local libraries and bookstores where they live, and she's investigated them. First of all, very clever idea. She first went to the archives for the public libraries in Los Angeles, where they have records of what's available in all 72 libraries in Los Angeles. 72 libraries, grand total 300 books in Farsi. That's all, in Persian we call it, okay? She looked at books in bookstores. The books in Farsi bookstores, specialized in Persian language, basically had two kinds of books. pedagogical grammars. If you want to learn Farsi, here's how to do it the old-fashioned way. Or what she described as very, very difficult books that are difficult even for native speakers. Her conclusion, and this is what she says in her paper, which will be out in the journal Language Magazine, lack of accessibility and comprehensibility of reading sources play a significant role in explaining why Farsi heritage language learners might struggle with acquiring the language. I've talked to young people who come from Iranian families. Do you speak Farsi? Oh, a little bit, not very much. Not the way it could be with a very small change. Let my bitterness come out now. Here it comes. We cheerfully spend so much money on technology, some of which is good, but most of which is doubtful, and very expensive, millions of dollars. And we're reluctant to buy books, ordinary books, magazines, comics, light books, heavy books, etc. My conclusion, I hope I've made a case for pleasure reading in general in language education. Pleasure reading builds language, and it's academic language, the kind we want, and it builds knowledge, and fiction does this. We want it in first language, and we want it in second language. We want it to be in all parts of our bilingual programs. Libraries, libraries, libraries. The school librarian is our best friend. Final point, when we do bilingual education and we give, say, children subject matter instruction in math, which will help them when math is taught in English, this is what we could call focused and specific. It's to help them in a certain academic situation. The reading that you get, the knowledge that you get by pleasure reading is not focused. It could be all over the place. It could be helpful in school. Maybe it's not helpful right away. It might be helpful someday, etc. I still think it's our major source of knowledge, and it's wonderful, and we should do it. A couple of experts in language arts have suggested ways of combining the two, of making the knowledge you get through reading relevant to subject matter, and I think they're both very clever and they deserve mention. Similar ideas, Donalyn Miller in her book, The Book Whisperer, and Nancy Atwell in The Reading Zone. Here's the idea. I'll use an example I got from Donalyn. Let's say you're teaching language arts, first language or second language, and you want to teach about biography, the genre biographies. You have to do this. The assignment is each child reads 3 biographies of anybody. Could be a sports figure, could be a politician, a movie star. The class comes together. As a class, they've read 50, 60 biographies. You have a rich basis for discussion. You're teaching a history class. It's the history of World War I is the topic. The assignment, each child reads 3 books that have to do with World War I. Fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter. Perfect for a high school class. The children come to school, the students come to school with a vast knowledge of World War I. Very easy to start teaching them. Well, this is my message today. My message is let's pay attention to pleasure reading. Let's make sure the reading is available in the first language and in the second language. Thank you very much.